Tonight, I do want to ask you a question to get started, and it's a pretty easy one, I hope. What's one of the greatest teachable moments that you've ever experienced in your life? It could be extremely difficult. It could have been extremely positive in nature. Maybe not much pain at all. So there was a hand back here. Okay. A lonely season. All right. First time. What did you learn about that lesson? Teachable moment. Fair enough. Fair enough. Anybody else? Yeah, Michaela. Okay. Yeah, teachable moment. Right? And we would all, if we went around the room, the more time that we had to think, obviously, I'm sure that many of us would have something that really rocked our life or changed us completely. One of mine was in 2006. I was a senior in high school. It was August of my senior year, and I was driving to go visit some friends to go watch a movie, and pulled out on the highway by my house and sat in the median, was trying to turn north so I could go across the interstate to take a shortcut to the movie theater. And as I sat there, I had several SUVs pull into the turn lane that I couldn't see around, and so I made my best guess, and my guess was wrong. As I pulled out, I said, yeah, it's pretty clear. Pull out, and I was met with the full force of a 2006 Camry, and hit the side of my truck, T-boned me, and going about 70 miles an hour, and in a moment, my life changed forever. I remember spinning in the highway and the interstate. I saw oncoming traffic. There was a semi-truck that had jackknifed that. And all of this is happening in the moment, and the only thing that I could feel like that I could do is hit the gas to try to move off of the road, but I couldn't go anywhere because everything had snapped on my vehicle, and I was just sitting there. Within a second later, the cars were moving to the other side. The semi had gained control and was going around me, and things changed in that moment. And I remember being an 18-year-old kid. Man, I learned two things. One, that life is fragile. And two, that God had a plan for my life. And it was that season that was a very teachable moment for me. Though frightening, though scary, though terrifying, I realized that my life mattered and that God had a purpose for it. God actually used that to begin to call me into ministry and to develop a heart and love for college students, and really began to do a lot of stuff from that difficult, hard, life-altering, teachable moment in my life. And maybe you haven't experienced anything to that degree. I hope you haven't, and I hope you never will. I hope God can show you a different way maybe to teach you moments like that. But divine interruptions are something that we often experience, whether we realize it or not, where literally God abrupts your life. He stops it where it's headed, and He turns it completely different in the direction that He desires you to go and not your own. And tonight we're continuing our series. Our series is entitled Grace for the Runaway. We are in the book of Jonah. And so go ahead and turn to the book of Jonah if you are able to find it. It's a little book in the Old Testament near the book of Micah. And don't feel pressured or bugged by your neighbors to be made fun of if you turn to the table of contents. You're all welcomed here for that. So go ahead and turn to the book of Jonah. As you're turning there, I want to remind you, like we talked about last week, Jonah is a very unique book. It's known as a prophetic narrative, which means it is a story. It is a compilation of stories about the prophet Jonah, which is extremely rare because most prophetic books are actually taking the words of God from God and speaking through the men of God to the people of God. And Jonah's a little different. Jonah is actually a book of an anti-prophet, of an individual who has been given the call to take the message of God and distribute it to people. Yet we learned last week that couldn't be further from his heart or desire, and he began to run. So it's actually about the heart of the prophet of Jonah when we look at that. And so I pray that tonight God does a work in our hearts, that He really would do some surgery and expose some things that we need to see and dig out the things that need to be brought out for His glory. in our life. And that really is the reason why we began these 3 questions last week. And I want to ask you again, just to kind of get our hearts right for tonight, and it's this. Am I currently engaged in the mission of God? Am I currently and actively engaged in the mission of God right now? The second question is, who am I willing to engage for the mission of God, and who am I unwilling to engage in the mission of God? Kind of a double question. Who am I willing to engage, and who am I not willing to engage with the mission of God? And lastly, which is a tough one, am I willing to give up my comforts so that others may join the mission of God? Am I willing to give up my comforts so that others may join in the mission of God? I'm so glad that Lachlan is here and God has moved and stirred in his life, and he's made choices that I'm sure were not comfortable, but there's a burning passion and a desire for people that he loves dearly. Some he doesn't even know the name of, but he's been praying forever for, so that they can join in worship like we have tonight, of a God that they have a relationship with. And God is using him, he's using his ministry, and he's using all of us if we are willing to step in obedience and to answer these questions honestly. And so Jonah was directly told by God, hey, there is judgment headed to this group of people in this great city known as Nineveh, this city that is extremely known for their violence, their extreme absurdity when it comes to their treatment of people. They're actually a very vile people. Their evil has risen up to the point of where I've taken notice, and something has to happen. In fact, I am calling you, Jonah, to take a message of judgment to them for the sake of them repenting from their sins and worshiping me. And Jonah seems to be pretty okay up to that last point where his enemies, the people that he could not stand, were coming into a relationship with God. In fact, we saw this last week, that he didn't just go away a little ways out of the way to Nineveh, right? Like, he looked, if you see the map that we have, look at that, 2,500 miles out of the way, he is headed to Tarshish to run away from God's calling, but more importantly, God's presence. And he's known as the runaway, right? That's how we ended last week. He's the runaway. And in this passage tonight that we're going to look at, God brings a very teachable moment to the life of Jonah in a very vivid and powerful way. And we got through 3 whopping verses last week. So we're going to try to move a little bit quicker tonight, but let's see how far we get. So go ahead and turn to chapter 1 in Jonah. And the main point tonight that I want you to know is this, is that true and genuine worship of God is expressed through our unhindered obedience to God. That true and genuine worship of God is expressed through our unhindered obedience to God. And we're going to see that throughout our passage tonight. Someone read verses 1 through 3 for us in Jonah chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. Go to Nineveh, the great city. Verse 4, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. There's nothing uncommon about storms. In fact, many of these men on the boat would have been very familiar with storms. But something that is very unique about this storm is that our text says that God himself actually, through his own action, hurled a storm like a javelin, like a spear into the sea, right at Jonah to hit him where he was at. This fleeing prophet was hit with a great wind in the storm. And as we saw last week, Jonah is seeking to outrun God. And there's something very important that I want us to see right at the beginning of tonight. The problem with running from God is that God knows and is already where you are going. Okay, let me say that again. The problem with running from God is that God knows, and He's already where you are going. Because there's this beautiful thing that we see throughout the book of Psalms, and Psalms 24 talks about this, that God's dominion is over everything in the earth. In fact, 24 verses 1 and 2 says this in Psalms: "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For He founded it upon the seas and established it upon the waters." So God's dominion is in the presence of where Jonah is seeking to run from Him at. So, and it says here that the ship threatened to break up. Now, this word threatened to break up is a very interesting word here. It's the Hebrew word hasab. Okay, and what that means is actually to consider or plan. All right, this is really different because we're talking about a ship. The ship is being personified as something that is responding in a specific way to this storm. Right? It didn't just say, hey, the boat started tearing to pieces. But it says that the boat considered or planned or threatened intentionally to break apart. Everything about what it was beginning to break to pieces. And this is a personification that the ship is determining a response to this storm. And so, in contrast to a disobedient prophet, right, who's running away, who's fleeing the scene, this boat is responding first, not the prophet. And this is important because that which Jonah is fleeing to and fleeing from God was beginning to break apart. So this thing that Jonah said, man, this is going to keep me safe. This is actually going to provide me protection. This is going to make a way for me in my future. This is going to be what my confidence is in. This is going to take me where I want and need to go. God says it's not, and begins to break and shatter that which He is placing His confidence, His hope, and His trust in the stormy seas. He's taking him to a place where he needs to be. And that's not physical in any nature. God basically says, I'm going to bust up and break everything that you are relying on in this situation. And He does so. And we're not even into the 5th verse, and Jonah has already given us some pretty life-shattering truth, right? And I want to ask you this, because I think it's important for us to think about, is what person or what thing in your life have you placed your confidence in that if it were to crumble, if it were to break apart, if it were to no longer be there, if it were to be shattered, removed, displaced, you would be left without a purpose? Because that is what Jonah is experiencing. Jonah is running from a God that he knows very well, and he's seeking something that is unattainable. And many people in the world believe that God is distant, that He is not actively involved in the life of people in His creation. And we see a very different story in the book of Jonah. We see God taking extreme notice in the life of Jonah in these passages. And so instead of a prophet of God recognizing God's work, the ship is the first to respond. And so maybe we're saying, well, we're giving Jonah a really hard time, right? He just was scared. He didn't want to do that. Well, he comes around, right? And he responds in the right manner. Verse 5. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah, get this, all right? But Jonah began to speak boldly about the things he knew about his God, right? Began to preach about His authority, His power, His salvation to these pagan mariners, to their gods, their salvation. Started lifting up praises to God and praying out for deliverance. Is that what it says? No, it says, but Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So Jonah was not the next to respond to this movement of God. He was actually the last to respond. Jonah was doing the exact opposite of responding, which is sleeping, right? There's nothing less responsive than when you're sleeping, and he's doing that. And so I don't want you to miss this. There is a very important thing that is happening in this passage. It is a downward movement of Jonah. A downward movement of Jonah, where Jonah is seeking to be further and further and further away from the presence of God. Look at the words that are used here. Even from the first few verses. He went down to Joppa. Then he went down into the ship. Then he went down into its belly, and then he went to sleep. Right? This is intentional, and it is showing us that when we choose to be disobedience over obedience, then it's a downward movement. There is no promotion for being rebellious against God. It doesn't promote us or bring us to any level of helpfulness. It actually is a dissension and a disordered identity that we see in Jonah and in his movement. And so, in other words, this began with a very small step. Right? When Jonah said, I'm not going to Nineveh, I'm actually going somewhere else. And then we get a glimpse of him in the belly of a ship in a terrible storm. We could ask ourselves, Jonah, how did you end up here? And it began with one small step of disobedience. And then another. And then another. And then another, then another, then another. And now he's fleeing from God in a sea that God created. And he's running from his presence. And this is so important because have you ever been swimming in an ocean? Anybody? All right? It's about to be beach season. You can probably relate to this. Right? You start off exactly where you left your flip-flops on the beach. Right? You get in the water and you just have a good time. Right? Let's say you get out a little bit further to where you're not necessarily standing, but you're kind of moving with the waves. Right? 10 minutes later go by, and you're 16 condos down the beach from where you started, right? That wasn't your intention. You were just enjoying the moment, right? You were living the dream in the beach. 16 condos later, you ask yourselves, how in the world did I get here, right? This is what sin does, right? We don't naturally drift towards godliness, we drift away from it. Right? We are either running towards God or away from God. We're either running towards our sin or we're fleeing from our sin. They're both intentional acts and decisions. We don't have a neutral ground. We don't naturally drift towards godliness. And we see this in the life of Jonah. And this story is not a story of God hating Jonah with this storm. It's actually a story of God loving Jonah. Because I want you to get this. One of the greatest examples of God's grace in our life is the actual fact that God is after you. Right? The very fact that God is after you. He's not leaving you alone. Right? Conviction of our sin should always be desired more than numbness of it. Right? We should always desire conviction of our sin and not numbness from it. Because it's the fact that God is working in our hearts. That the Spirit is working and molding and shaping us to be more like Christ. And that's a powerful moment to notice that it's painful and it's tough, but God is actually present and working. That is graciousness from God. We talked about this last week. A hero is one who goes where the needs are present. They don't run from it. They actually go where needs are present. And Jonah is doing the opposite. He is the anti-hero. He is the anti-prophet. He is playing the villain. And so we see further, verse 6. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. God, through this pagan captain, this captain who worshipped other gods that we see in this passage, tells Jonah to get woke, right? Wake up. Are you kidding me? How can you be asleep right now? We've been crying out to our gods all this while, and you're sleeping? Are you kidding? Speak to your God, whoever he is, and tell him to do something, is the words of this prophet. He says, arise, you sleeper, wake up and rise up. And we expect a prophet of God to actually, in that moment, rise up and be a hero and cry out to his God. But we don't see that. In fact, God sent this storm to wake up the prophet, but it's these pagans that are the ones that notice that there's actually divine power that is happening here. This is an ironic role reversal. In fact, here's what they say. Perhaps the God, your God, will give a thought to us that we may not perish. Would you say by reading this that God is giving a thought towards them? Okay, would you say that God is giving a thought towards Jonah? Okay, would you say that God gives a thought towards you? It's very clear that God is active and working, and this story began with God giving a thought to a people who were far from Him. An actual care and love for those who didn't know Him. This is who God is. In fact, you can say it with me if you know it. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him shall not perish, but have eternal or everlasting life. And it continues in verse 17. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through Him. So these sailors are asking, does this God give a thought to us, and will He save us? Is what they're asking Jonah. It's almost like they're giving him a soft toss as a prophet to declare the gospel, that they need this God, and this is this God who does care and give a thought and is the source of your salvation. Here's who He is. These pagans are bringing this before Him, and He chooses not to. They were not only needing the gospel, they were looking for the gospel. They were looking for deliverance and salvation. And they noted that God, this God, was the one that could potentially be the answer. And they're almost giving Him this. If not the Ninevites, then maybe these sailors. And this is something we can't just blow past, because even in the midst of Jonah's rebellion, God's concern is the lost. Like God is still working and using Jonah in the midst of his rebellion with the same call that He called him to a different people. And say, okay, if not the Ninevites, maybe you'll be obedient now in a small space with these sailors where literally there's nothing else left to do than to tell them who I am and preach to them the gospel or the saving faith that I offer, and He moves away from that as well. And so even in this, God's grace extends despite Jonah's rebellion. Unfortunately, this is not what he proclaimed. Let's continue, 7 through 9. Someone read that. Yeah. So these sailors basically roll the dice. They roll the dice, and it lands on Jonah. There's something up with this Jonah guy that's causing this. But get this, Jonah doesn't hesitate to proclaim who he is. He doesn't hesitate really to even say who God is, sort of. What he does hold is acting out as if those were true. Right? So he says, I'm a Hebrew, which in this context is basically saying, yeah, I know what's going on. I'm a Hebrew. I'm part of the chosen people of God. I'm kind of a big deal. And I do fear the Lord, and the Lord's the one who actually made the land and the sea. And that's it, right? And we see this, that what he says is true, but it's not actually lived out in his life. He has the theology right. He has the knowledge right, but he's not living like it's true. And I want to say this because it's part of what we're talking about tonight. Is that proud proclamation is different than repentant disposition. Right? Proud proclamation is different than being in a repentant position in our life. And he proudly proclaimed who he was and maybe even a little bit of who this God was, but there was no repentance for what he had done. There was no brokenness over his running away from him. In other words, we can have a right and we can have a weighty knowledge of who God is, but still be engaged in worthless worship of God. Right? We can have the knowledge, but not the true, genuine worship of God. And that's the point tonight, is that true and genuine worship of God is expressed through our unhindered obedience to God. We see Jonah's response, that this rattling off of religious jargon, basically, I'm better than you guys, and my God's better than your gods, but it's not really affecting my life. He made the seas and he made the land, but I'm running from him on a boat, and it doesn't make sense if he created these things. And so his theology was correct, but he had failed to be obedient to what he actually believed. I want to ask you, what characteristics of God do you believe? Do you actually hold true and know to be true, but are not visible in the way that you live? Right? We can say that, man, my God is faithful, but I don't ever step out to where he has to be faithful, or this isn't going to work out. Right? He's the God that loves the nations and desires the gospel to get to the nations, but that's not really my thing. You know, we can say that we believe that God is a certain way and know it to be true, yet we don't live in obedience to it. We don't worship him with that action. And it continues in verse 10. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord because he had told them. Their response was fear. They knew that if what Jonah was saying about this God was true, then his problem was also theirs, because he's in their boat. And they're in the sea that God made, and they're good at math. They're putting this together. This isn't going to work out well if what you're saying is true. Basically, he asked them this: why have you brought us into this? Right? If this is who you say you worship and believe in, and you're running from him, and you've turned your back on him, and you did all of these things to come in our boat, why would you do that to us? Why would you affect us with your disobedience? And this is important because our disobedience never just affects us. Amen. It never just affects us. It always affects others. Always affects others. Even being part. Have you ever been a part of someone's bad decision? It still affected you. And our lives are like that when we are disobedient to the Lord. Those in our spheres have been brought into its effects constantly. And so the greatest gift that you can give someone, and that I can give someone, is to walk in obedience with the Lord. That's the greatest gift that we can ever give any single person in our life, no matter what they mean to us, no matter who they are, is to walk closely with God. That's the greatest gift that we can provide for someone. And so the purpose of this really is to bring us to a place where we're asking, are people brought to a decision on what to do with God? based on how we live? Right? And if so, what are those decisions being led to? Right? If someone were to look at your life and how you live and you proclaim and you worship, you sing the songs, you know the words, you know the verses, you come to the church, but their view of God is limited to what they see in you and how you live, what is their view of God like? Because to these pagans, they're not really seeing much from Jonah. They see God and they see Jonah, the prophet. Verse 11. Then they said to him, "What shall we do, that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous." He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." And we may read this and we say, man, Jonah, he actually got it. He had a noble moment. It sounds like Jonah's realizing his compassion and love for these sailors, and that any harm that's being done to them is actually part of his own disobedience. And that may be true, but it also could be true that Jonah is at rock bottom and simply just wants to die, because dying is easier than going to Nineveh. In fact, we know that because Jonah speaks like that throughout the book of Jonah, that he would rather just die than do what God is telling him to do. And so Jonah would rather be disobedient and die than obedient and repent. That's really what it comes down to. He would rather be disobedient and die than be obedient and have to repent. This may actually be one of the most selfish things that Jonah's done so far, because guess what? He could have jumped off the boat himself. If he really thought that this was going to end by him removing or being removed from the situation, he could have just jumped off the boat. But now he's bringing them into play and saying, well, if they throw me off the boat into the sea, then maybe I'm not the only one who is being disobedient here. It's very eye-opening that if they throw him overboard, then his blood is on their hands. And it's not on his own disobedience. And the reason why I say that is because we read in these couple verses later, "Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, 'O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done it as it pleased you.'" They know that throwing Jonah overboard is putting his blood on their hands. And their response sounds like what Jonah should be saying. Can anyone tell me where Jonah has prayed so far? Up to this point? It's not there. In fact, the only person that's praying here are these pagan individuals who once worshipped other gods. And verse 14 says, "Therefore they called out to the Lord." So if what Jonah's saying about this God is true, then they know that he is listening. Then they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish in this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, for have done as it has pleased you." Ultimately, their ending cry was a genuine desire, not of knowledge or to just acknowledge God, but to act in obedience to his will. This sets them apart from Jonah, because true and genuine worship of God is expressed as not in knowledge alone, but it's in unhindered obedience to God. So our portion ends with these two verses in 15 and 16. It says, "So they picked up Jonah, and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him." So while Jonah is sent into the ocean, these men are worshiping the Lord. They are worshiping this living God, forsaking their foreign gods and worshiping him. And despite his disobedience, Jonah is graciously used to draw these men to experience the salvation and the deliverance of the living God, despite his unwillingness and desire for it. And it says over and over that these men feared the Lord. And it's so important because Proverbs 9:10, you know this, it's fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And our passage calls us tonight to really look at our lives and assess where we are in our worship life. Right? Because knowledge without obedience is worthless. Amen. Jonah knew about God, but he didn't act in obedience to him. These men knew nothing about this God, but acted in obedience once they did. And they are wise in this passage. So tonight, the world really is hungry for people like you and I to walk in salt and light and actually live and worship a God that if we truly believe is who he says he is, then we need to live like it's true. And so like Jonah, we need to wake up and we need to rise up and we need to walk in obedience to those things. There are things, no doubt, in your life right now that God is stirring and moving and calling you to be obedient in. And you may not be running from it, but it's scary and it's preventing you, something is preventing you from getting to a place where you are all in and abandoning and saying, God, whatever you want is what's going to bring you the most glory and is going to be for my good. And I'm doing that because I want to worship you with my life. I want to glorify you with everything that I am. And so if we believe that Jesus is the Lord, that he truly conquered the grave, and that he truly is the only way that we are saved, then let's live like that's true with our life. Everything about our life. True and genuine worship of God is expressed in our unhindered obedience to God. As we get prepared to sing a final song of response, I want you to think about this. If creation still obeys you, so will I. If the stars were made to worship you, so will I. If the mountains bow in reverence, so will I. If the oceans roar your greatness, so will I. For if everything exists to lift you high, so will I. If the wind goes where you send it, so will I. Will you? Not just sing the words to a song that you know in your head, but your life cry be wherever the wind, where you send it, it goes, and so will I. Is that true in your life tonight? Let's pray.